What would he say about our democracy?
Nietzsche would, you know Karl Marx's famous phrase, religion is the opiate of the masses? Mm-hmm. Well, for Nietzsche, look, I can answer you in this way. Nietzsche wished to destroy Christianity and replace it with another religion, a religion of the superior human being. In other words, Nietzsche's teaching is a very radical, extremely rhetorical version of what's been going on in modern Western Europe for the last 300 years. I mean, it's a kind of carrying out of Descartes, the French philosopher and mathematician's statement in his Discourse on Method, that science, and with it the correct philosophy, will enable human beings to become as masters and possessors of nature. That was back in the 17th century. Now, obviously, if we become masters and possessors of nature, that means that we throw out the previous master and possessor, and that's God. So, I mean, there's an intrinsic atheistic element in modernity, and in particular in the modern philosophical tradition. That's not to say that all modern people are atheists, but that has to be recognized. Nietzsche is another one, as was Marx, of those people who wishes to allow for the development of a superior human being. And in order to do that, he sees that we have to destroy the culture that has produced the previous human beings. So that's one part of my reply to you. Now, what does religion have to do with this? Well, the previous religion, let's just call it Christianity, must be destroyed because the values of Christianity have been a major ingredient, if not the major ingredient, in the preparation of corrupt people. I mean, now let's put some flesh on those bones so that your audience can know exactly what Nietzsche didn't like. He did not like weakness. He did not like pacifism. He did not like egalitarianism. He did not like Jesus turning the other cheek. He did not like Jesus appealing to the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and the halt. He saw Christianity, if I may put it colloquially, as a religion for losers. He wanted to inculcate a spirit of warrior-like creativity, of people who would not be bound by sentimentality for the average person or for the inferior person or for the disadvantaged, as we call them today. To Nietzsche, this would have all been sentimentality. So he would not at all have been impressed by the fact that we're all going to church. The second point you asked about was democracy. Now, this is interesting, Brian, because Nietzsche today is extraordinarily popular, not simply among right-wing thinkers, but among left-wing thinkers as well. I mentioned earlier in this discussion that there are, our century, the 20th century, has been one of any number of liberation groups. It's also been a century of the spread of democracy. It's been a century of the spread of ideas of egalitarianism, fairness, and so on. I mean, these are terms that intellectuals in London or Belgrade, as we now see with excitement on the television, or New York, all use with equal frequency. Nietzsche was really opposed to that. I mean, Nietzsche was what I would call a revolutionary of the right. He is confused by, I think, many well-meaning people from the left because he's confused as a spokesman for their views because he talks a great deal about uniqueness and creativity and individuality and so on. But what he meant by that was that the Superman would have to create a new civilization such that the non-creative people, namely the great majority, would benefit simply by participating in it. In other words, by exemplifying the values of Nietzsche's morality, which would replace Christ's morality. I mean, from a Christian standpoint, Christians are obedient to the teaching of Christ. Nietzsche wishes to replace the teaching of Christ by his own teaching. One of the books that he wrote was called The Antichrist. The last work he wrote, Ecce Homo, you know, it's a biblical expression, behold the man. Nietzsche, quite seriously, saw himself as a great historical rival to Christ. That was his ambition, to replace everything having to do with Christianity. And democracy, unfortunately, for our own tastes, from Nietzsche's standpoint, democracy was inferior. It was a kind of version of the sentimentality that one sees exemplified in Christianity. So those are my answers. They're not very pleasant, I'm afraid, to contemporary taste, but those are the answers. Now, may I add that if you have 5 other people on your program, you might get 5 different answers. I don't think it's that they would be right. I mean, I think that Nietzsche was not a liberal. He was not a revolutionary in in the left sense of the term. He was a man who believed in rank ordering. As he often said, my key concept is rank ordering. He was a man who believed in the nobility of the spirit. He despised the rabble, the people, the crowd, as he called them variously. He wished them no harm. On the contrary, he wished to raise them up. But the only way in which they could be raised up is by being trained properly, if I could put it that way. I'm speaking for Nietzsche, not myself. The only way in which the people could be raised up is by being given a proper education. I mean, this is not a notion that is foreign to us today. But the content of the education that they would be given would be quite different from the one that obtains in modern 20th century European democracies. So, in short, anti-religious in the traditional sense, and by no means, in no sense of the term, a Democrat, as that word is used in contemporary political discussion.
Why should we care what this man thinks? And who has made him someone that you read and think about?
His extraordinary influence. And when I say that, I don't mean that the influence necessarily worked out as he had intended it. But Nietzsche states in the most effective way that I'm familiar with the following view. Traditional philosophy, traditional morality is all a lie. Life is in fact chaos. That is to say, intrinsically it's chaos. Whatever order exists in the world has been produced by human beings. Orders live, are born, live, mature, grow old, and die just like individual people. When an order, a political order or a social order or a set of values, a society, historical epoch, all of these terms amount to much the same thing. When such a structure begins to get old and to deteriorate, then it leads to what Nietzsche calls decadence, I mean decay. And if the decadence is allowed to proceed untreated, you could make a medical analogy here. In other words, if you have a tumor and you don't treat it, then it's going to spread throughout the body politic, and it's going to deteriorate the standards and the values of the civilization. And this will be a long, drawn-out process in which people will become more and more decadent and more mediocre. Consequently, what we have to do, that is to say what a man like Nietzsche has to do, is to destroy that civilization. And he states very radically the need to destroy tradition. And that is very appealing. I mean, the 20th century is a century still of revolutions. And he also speaks very clearly about the inadequacy of moral teachings which restrain us. And people who don't wish to be restrained by moral teachings, who don't wish to be, as they would put it, slaves of a supernatural being, find something extremely appealing in Nietzsche. Nietzsche was influential in bad ways, very bad ways. For example, he influenced, not intentionally, but the Nazis were influenced by Nietzsche. I mean, there are horrifying passages in Zarathustra. One passage about the blonde beast who will come down from the north, you know, into the plains of the Mediterranean and destroy the mongrel races that are living there. I mean, that's, you know, Hitler and his propagandists made use of passages of that sort. Because Nietzsche, as part of Nietzsche's teaching about the Superman, there was a kind of biological Superman, the notion of a biological Superman, of a being of enormous strength and health. Nietzsche himself was quite sick, as I mentioned earlier, and people have speculated, you know, that he had a kind of almost desperate romantic interest in and enthusiasm for health because of his own miserable physical existence. However that may be, Nietzsche had influences which, depending upon your own political standpoint, were either good or terrible, but they were enormous. And one has to understand, I think, you know, the conditions of one's own time, and one can only understand that by studying the great masters, people like Nietzsche, who prepared the time in which we live. Is that a helpful answer to your question?
Yeah, but could you do this? And this may be a little bit harder. Who in this country today that we know, or maybe a better profile of the person, would be walking around with "Thus spoke Zarathustra" in their pocket as kind of their Bible? Can you define the kind of person, the kind of thinker today?
Well, again, I have to begin by emphasizing that Nietzsche is sufficiently difficult to understand and sufficiently ambiguous that he's inspired people of widely disparate views. So you could find, using this terminology of the left and the right, not in any polemical way, but simply because I think everyone's familiar with it, you will find people on the right who are very impressed with Nietzsche's critique of Christianity as a kind of religion of, as I put it earlier, losers. A religion which weakens the distinction between the noble and the base, which turns our attention from the high to the low.
Let me jump in to ask, when you say the right wing, but would right wing born-again Christians feel that way?
No, I doubt that they'd ever heard of Nietzsche, but I mean...
would they agree with his discussion?
Well, let me give you a specific example. Perhaps one of the 2 or 3 most famous philosophers of the 20th century, a man named Martin Heidegger, dead for some years, German philosopher who wrote a great deal on Nietzsche and who shared Nietzsche's distaste for modernity and for many, if not all, of the same reasons. I don't think that you would find Jerry Falwell appealing to Nietzsche because Nietzsche is an antichrist. But those people who saw themselves as freed or wishing to be freed from the traditional forms of Judeo-Christianity, or for that matter, Islam, those who in particular saw themselves as wishing to be freed from Christianity would find Nietzsche extremely appealing. Now, who are the people who wish to be freed from Christianity, just to follow out the single thought? Well, they can be on the left or the right, right? I mean, there are right-wing atheists and there are left-wing atheists. Left-wing atheists, I mean by that, again, nothing abusive, but people who believe that man makes his own values and we must respect each individual person and we must be fair and just to everyone, and there is no single point of view that is truly right. Religion and even many philosophies are therefore quite dogmatic, and that leads to a notion of a kind of an egalitarian democracy. Now, these people could find themselves using Nietzsche to justify some or all of their views. Sometimes they would be right, sometimes they would be wrong. Nietzsche was anti-Christian, but he was not a Democrat. So one has to reply to you rather cautiously. You could find admirers of Nietzsche in almost every sector of the intellectual world. And that's why the cumulative effect of Nietzsche's writing has been so powerful.